On the winter evening of Sunday, February 13, 1983, Turin moved at the slow, muffled pace that comes with snow and cold, the city wrapped in a pale hush as families finished late lunches, couples wandered home through slushy streets, and neighborhood cinemas filled with people seeking warmth and a few hours of escape. And among those ordinary refuges was the Cinema Statuto on Via Cibrario, a modest but well-known movie house that had served the surrounding district for decades and that afternoon was hosting a screening of a light-hearted French comedy, a choice that promised laughter and relief from the grayness outside, drawing in men and women of all ages, teenagers on dates, parents with children, friends and neighbors who greeted one another casually as they took their seats, unaware that the building itself, with its aging structure, outdated electrical systems, heavy curtains, foam-filled seats, and poorly enforced safety measures, was quietly primed for catastrophe. And as the lights dimmed and the projector flickered to life, no one inside could have imagined that the walls around them concealed conditions that would soon turn the space from a place of entertainment into one of the deadliest cinema disasters in Italian history. Because somewhere near the entrance area, in a zone cluttered with wiring and flammable materials, a small ignition occurred, likely sparked by an electrical fault interacting with fabric or insulation that had never been adequately fireproofed. And at first the flame was insignificant, invisible to the audience and unnoticed by staff. But fire does not require attention to grow, only fuel and oxygen, and the Cinema Statuto provided both in abundance. As the blaze crept into curtains and wall coverings and then into the seats themselves, whose synthetic materials did not simply burn but melted and smoldered, releasing thick black smoke loaded with toxic gases that began to spread far faster than the flames, seeping upward and outward through the auditorium while the film continued to play for a few fatal minutes longer, during which time the invisible threat multiplied with terrifying speed. And when the first patrons sensed something was wrong, it was not because they saw fire but because their eyes began to sting, their throats tightened, and the air grew harsh and unbreathable, and whispers of confusion turned into shouts as someone finally yelled that there was smoke, prompting heads to turn, bodies to rise, and panic to bloom unevenly across the rows. Some people standing frozen in disbelief while others instinctively rushed toward the exits they had entered through, only to discover in horror that the primary escape routes were already compromised, as smoke poured through doorways and corridors, and emergency exits that should have offered salvation were locked, blocked, or difficult to locate in the darkness, a violation of safety principles that would later become central to investigations and public outrage. And as the projector stopped and the lights failed, plunging the room into near darkness broken only by the orange glow of fire at the edges, the situation deteriorated from alarming to lethal in moments, because the smoke filling the room was not merely obscuring vision but actively killing, depriving lungs of oxygen and flooding bodies with carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide, gases that induced disorientation, unconsciousness, and death rapidly, especially in enclosed spaces. And people who tried to run found their legs weakening, their balance failing, their sense of direction collapsing as panic and hypoxia combined, leading some to fall and be trampled in the crush while others veered into side rooms, bathrooms, or corners in desperate attempts to escape the choking air, choices that tragically sealed their fate when those spaces filled even faster with smoke and offered no secondary exits. And on the upper level of the cinema, where the balcony seated many spectators, the danger was even greater because smoke naturally rises, and within minutes the gallery became a suffocating trap, the stairways down clogged with bodies and confusion, the exits unreachable or unusable, and witnesses would later describe scenes of terror as people clawed at doors, shouted names of loved ones, and collapsed where they stood, overcome not by flame but by the silent, merciless chemistry of combustion. And outside, as emergency calls finally reached authorities, firefighters rushed through snow-slicked streets toward Via Cibrario, unaware of the full scale of what awaited them. And when they arrived they were met by thick plumes of smoke billowing from the cinema's facade and by survivors staggering into the cold, coughing, crying, some with burned clothing, others collapsing onto the pavement as oxygen finally reached their lungs. And the firefighters forced their way inside wearing breathing apparatus, battling heat, zero visibility, and the psychological shock of encountering rows of motionless bodies in aisles and seats, scenes that would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives as they carried victims out one by one, unsure who might still be saved and who was already gone. and as ambulances lined the street and hospitals across Turin prepared for mass casualties, it became clear that the disaster was not a small accident but a major tragedy, one that would ultimately claim the lives of 64 people ranging in age. From young children to middle-aged adults, most of whom died from smoke inhalation within minutes of the fire's outbreak, leaving behind families shattered by sudden loss, children orphaned, parents grieving sons and daughters, and a city struggling to comprehend how a simple afternoon at the movies could end in such devastation. And in the days that followed, Turin entered a period of mourning marked by funerals, public vigils, and a heavy atmosphere of anger and sorrow as attention turned inevitably toward responsibility and prevention, because it soon emerged that the Cinema Statuto had failed to meet essential safety standards, that exits were improperly secured, that materials used inside were dangerously flammable, and that oversight had been lax, failures that transformed an ordinary fire into a mass casualty event. And legal proceedings followed, focusing on the cinema's owner and on regulatory shortcomings, as prosecutors argued that negligence and disregard for safety had directly contributed to the deaths. And while court judgments and sentences could never restore what was lost, they served as an acknowledgement of accountability and a signal that such failures could no longer be tolerated. And beyond the courtroom, the Statuto disaster forced Italy to confront uncomfortable truths about public safety in entertainment venues, prompting stricter regulations, improved fire codes, mandatory emergency lighting, unlocked and outward opening exits, better materials, and more rigorous inspections, changes written in the memory of those who died, so that their deaths might at least prevent future ones. And even decades later, the name Cinema Statuto remains etched into Italian collective memory as a symbol of preventable tragedy. A reminder that disaster often arises not from dramatic explosions but from small oversights accumulated over time, and that the cost of ignoring safety is paid not in abstract numbers but in human lives. Stories cut short in the dark, and a city forever altered by a fire that burned for minutes but left scars that endure across generations. And as investigators reconstructed the sequence of events with painstaking care, the story of that afternoon grew heavier and more complex, because the fire itself, though deadly, was only the final expression of years of accumulated neglect, complacency, and systemic failure that had quietly transformed the Cinema Statuto into a trap, beginning with the building's age and layout, which dated back to an era when fire regulations were minimal and rarely updated, and continuing through renovations that prioritized seating capacity and aesthetic appeal over safety, with thick curtains, acoustic panels, and decorative fabrics added without adequate fireproofing, and electrical systems extended and modified over time in an improvised manner that left cables overloaded and poorly insulated, conditions that many inspectors later acknowledged were not unique to this cinema but common across the country, revealing how normalized risk had become in everyday public spaces. Witness testimonies collected from survivors painted a picture of confusion unfolding second by second, as people described the initial disbelief that swept through the audience when the smell of smoke first reached them, many assuming it was part of the film or a technical issue, a delay that cost precious moments, because in enclosed environments fire does not announce itself loudly at first, it advances silently through air quality rather than flame, and by the time visibility dropped and panic became unavoidable, the most dangerous gases had already reached lethal concentrations, particularly in the upper sections of the auditorium, where heat and smoke accumulated rapidly, and survivors recalled how their bodies reacted instinctively, eyes watering uncontrollably, lungs burning, legs trembling, thoughts fragmenting as oxygen deprivation set in, making rational decision-making nearly impossible. Some survivors later spoke of moments that felt suspended in time, of holding a child's hand and then losing grip in the chaos, of hearing someone fall behind them and being unable to turn back, of collapsing near an exit only to be dragged out by another fleeing patron or by a firefighter pushing through the smoke, acts of chance and proximity that determined who lived and who did not, while many victims were found seated where they had been moments earlier, overcome so quickly by fumes that they never reached an aisle, their expressions frozen in ordinary poses that contrasted cruelly with the violence of their deaths. Inside the cinema, the fire's behavior itself was later analyzed in detail, as experts explained how the polyurethane foam used in the seats, when ignited, produces dense smoke rich in carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide, substances far more deadly than heat alone, and how the lack of proper ventilation and smoke extraction systems allowed these gases to pool and circulate, turning the auditorium into a lethal chamber within minutes, a dynamic that explained why so many victims showed minimal burn injuries yet died where they sat or stood, a reality that shocked the people.